Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to part 2 in the Django Unboxed series. In this tutorial, we're actually going to be going through what the settings file is in our project. Um, Might have saw a glimpse of it in my last tutorial on how to set up our environment. But today I'm actually going to go through it line by line and tell you exactly what everything is. Um, so a couple things I want to harp on before we get or talk about before we actually get into what the settings file is. Basically, why we or what our settings are and why we use them. The reason why we have a settings file is so that we can centralize all of our application or excuse me project settings for everything that we use. For example, the database, static files, media files, middlewares, authorizations, our applications that we're actually going to be creating. I like to call them microservices, but they are considered applications. So it gives us a place to put them all in one, or it gives us a file to put all of those settings in one place so that we can, um, you know, reference those and use those instead of having multiple files. And they're declared in different applications. Like each application has a setting file, and it gets a little convoluted. So these settings file that the settings file that we're gonna go over is very useful and vital to our project. Another reason why we use it is because because it's in a centralized location, we can have multiple versions of it. So for example, if I have a development project that I'm working on and I want to turn it into a production, those settings are going to drastically vary between the two. For instance, I personally like to have two separate databases, one for development for dummy data and the other one for actual production for real data. Um, this gives us that separation of concerns that allows us to distinctly differentiate the difference between a development server or a development project and a production project. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and dive right in and I'm going to switch over. See you in a bit. All right, now that I switched over, we're actually going to get started. So what I have here is I have PyCharm Professional open. I'm just going to create a new project, a new Django project, and I'm going to call it the name of my series. Let's see, Django Unboxed. There we go. Oop, unboxed. I'm going to create a new content environment like you saw in my previous tutorials, and I'm going to be using Python 3.8. This takes a little bit to spin up, but we're going to go ahead and give it a shot, or wait for it to complete. Um, give it a second. Hopefully I can stall long enough for this to finish installing and launching. So basically right now what it's doing is it's creating a new environment for us, and it's installing Django, it's installing a new Python version, and it's actually going to create our base project for us. That's what's so nice about PyCharm Professional. I love it. If you have the opportunity to get it, get it. All right, so if we come in here, we see our base project. In here, we have our settings file, and that's the main topic of this discussion today. I'll go over the other stuff in my next tutorial, or I might cover it a little bit here, but we'll see what happens. So let's get started. So this is your basic settings file. You can see I'm using Django 3.15 at the time of creating this video. So to start off with, you see this base directory. If I didn't minimize it or switch files, let's see. You see this base directory right here. All right. So this allows us to reference it various and multiple times throughout our settings file, and you will see it. Actually, there's an example right there. What this does is this actually gets the current path for this directory right here and initiates this variable and sets it to that path. So that's pretty simple. It's nothing really confusing about that. It uses this library in order to do that, so it's pretty simple. Okay, so this secret key. This secret key is something you never want to share with anyone. This secret key is actually used to calculate your hash and your salt for your encryption on your users. So, for example, a new user signs up to your website and they enter their email and password. Well, their password goes through this secret key, or uses this secret key for an encryption hash and salt combination of the two to create I think they use SHA 256 in order to encrypt the passwords. I'm not entirely sure on that, but anyway, they use this as a key to encrypt that data. That's something you never want to use in production ever. Normally, you would store that using environment variables, and whenever we go into that production tutorial, you will see how to implement that in your environment variables. Okay, so next thing is this debug option here. This option allows us to actually render errors to the web page. For example, if you have a template error that's, like a variable is unassigned in your template syntax, you will get those errors on your web page instead of an error or not showing an error and you don't understand what's going on or why Django can't find that specific variable that you're trying to reference. So while we're not in production, so while we're in development phase, we're actually going to keep this set to true so we can see those errors. We will, whenever we go to develop our 404 pages, 400 pages, I'll explain what those are later. We will actually change this to false and test those out using or by changing this setting. This allowed host option. This option is basically mostly used in production. Or if you want to locally host your website, for example, you want to open it up to your router so anybody on your Wi-Fi can access it, or your network. Basically, what this allows you to do is actually host your file locally or in production. And what you do is you just pass in the IP address of your servers or your local host. For example, you can even just right quick, we can call it, let's see, 127.0.0.1. You can do 0.0.0.0, right? I think that's right. Anyway, these are just various IP addresses that you can pass in here. I will show you how to set these up whenever you go to production. Normally, whenever you try to put it in production and you turn debug off, you will actually get error warnings saying, hey, this IP address is not allowed in the allowed host option in your settings file. And at that point, that's when we go change it. You do not want to open this up and say anything like 0.0.0. You never want to do that. Or you would never want to use a star, right? You always want to be very specific on your allowed host option here. I think that's enough about that. We'll cover that a lot more in the production whenever we go to switch over to a production application or switch this application over to the production phase. Okay, so next comes up is the installed list or installed apps. Excuse me. It is a list, all right, and this is order specific. So this list is probably where you're going to be spending a lot of time in your settings file. Basically, whenever you add a new application to your Django project, for example, we're going to be creating the polls application. I don't need to load it before I load the authentication or admin page, right? So I don't need to put it here. I do prefer and recommend that you put it at the very end here, right? That's only because we want to load the administration page and the authorizations. We want to load the content types, the session, and the messages and static files prior to even loading our other application. It comes in real handy. For example, if you want to create a custom user model, you would actually, whenever you go to create the app for the custom user model, you will include this custom user model prior to this authorization model here, right? So if I come here and I say custom user, right, which we will be coding for allowing users to input their email address instead of creating a username, right? We would actually want to load this prior to our authorization model. And that's because we're overriding it and we are creating our own user instead of using the built-in one that comes with Django. So that is an instance in where order matters and why it's important to explain that and fill you guys in. Next comes middleware. All right, so think of this as the interface between your actual request and your application. So for example, somebody goes to your website at criticaltechnetwork.com, right? and they make a request to your website, and it goes through the pathing, through settings, through URLs, or the application, then the URLs in the application, and responds with a request. Well, this middleware is an interface in between there to allow um, a couple of things to come through. For example, there's security features that are built in with Django that are, part of the batteries included, if you've ever heard that term. Um, that's the security middleware you see here. The session middleware is basically another security layer and allows you to stay like logged in if you go from one web page to another while you're logged in. Same thing with common middleware. The CSRF view middleware, that is a cross. I'm gonna have to look up the term for you. I can't remember it, but I know what it's for. That is used for the prevention of multiple form submissions. It's a security layer to help you encrypt the data that's being passed and forth between the view, the actual view, and or your form and the view model. This CSRF is actually required. Django requires you to have that in there just so you could prevent people filling out the same form and taking over your server and pinging it for hundreds of requests and shutting down your server and causing it to crash, overheat, etc. Um, this authentication middleware actually allows the authentication, like I said earlier, for the session middleware. It allows the user to stay logged in between different web pages, and it also helps with rendering the username, for example, in your website. So instead of, you know, just having you can actually display the username on your website, and this is that layer that helps you do that. The message middleware will actually give you messages based upon what you push to it in the view. So, for example, let's say somebody incorrectly filled out a form. This will give you those validation errors that we will be using using Bootstrap, the wire framework for HTML and CSS. And then this one is not so much important, but it is required. This is I'm sorry, it is important, but it's not so much important that we go over. Just know that you need to include it. This is preventing clickjacking and somebody taking over your site like we talked about earlier. Okay, your root URL config or conf. Basically, this is what points, this is a declaration to point to which URLs file we'll be using for your request to your website. So, for example, somebody goes to critical tech network / polls, right? This is what points it to this URLs file. And we'll go through all the pathing later and URL patterns, but just know it comes here, and then I would have a path that points to polls, right? I'll just put that in there, but we're actually not going to do that now. We'll go over that later. But just know that this is what points it to our URLs file to help make that request for the user to ping our database and respond with a poll. Okay, so this template here, this template's declaration helps or points Django to where we're actually going to keep our templates folder. As you can see here, there is a templates folder here that this is referencing. So it goes from our base directory, like we mentioned up here. This is the base directory. And then it goes to /templates, which references this folder here. Notice how there's nothing in there because we just created Django, a fresh Django application. But this allows you the ability to include templates folders. Now, because of the way I'm going to have this set up, we have an app directory here set equal to true. This app directory is actually a scan that Django does whenever it goes to launch your website or to run the server. Is like, hey, do you want to include template folders inside each app? And we will get into that on how to set it up properly. Just know that I do not like using this convention, only because whenever Django was first developed, it was built so that each application was essentially a microservice, a portable microservice. So, for example, I create a custom user model application. I can click and drag that or copy and cut that application into another project, right? And it should cleanly do that. Now, if I need to bring over templates, the reason why I'm pointing that out, if I need to bring over templates, that templates folder will be held inside that custom user model directory, or that microservice application, and allows me to take those templates and all the models and the views that I set up for those templates, and to drag those over to a new project with no interference, no discombobulation, no errors. The only thing I have to do is, once I copy and paste, is add that custom user model to my new project in the installed applications declaration. So I don't like really using this templates folder. We will delete it, just so I can focus on the microservice and the portability of all of our applications. And these context processors are something we're going to get into. So like I said earlier about this whole middleware passing in the authentication, or passing in user information to each and every website, we can actually access that from each and every website using this context processor. Um, and the same thing with request and debug. So this debug context processor is what renders those errors to the view, that allows us to see, hey, you misspelled this variable. We can't recognize this URL that you're trying to point to, and it gives us that nice, amazing error handling, and it's great for us to debugging in. We actually will create a context processors, our own custom one, so it's going to be really cool, so we can pass data back and forth between web pages without making an actual query for each and every view. So we'll get into that, and you'll see how all this works, and it's quite awesome. WSGI application. So what this is basically a way for us to launch our application in production phase, or how it will be hosted. I know specifically that Apache web server, or web hosting, it's an open source library that allows us to host websites on a Linux platform. Apache, with the WSGI modification, allows us to use this WSGI file here in order to run our application. So as you can see here, even here, it points to that settings file. So whenever a request comes in from Apache, it actually goes to the settings file. So it's really cool on how all that ties together. Again, we will reference that whenever we get into the production phase. Databases. All right, so this is a pretty big one. Excuse me. This database declaration here actually allows us to set up multiple databases. It allows us to set up a database that we're going to use. Django already comes built in and built out with a SQLite 3 database. Hence why I need you to, in my previous video, I told you to go download DB Browser for SQLite 3. And this is why. We will be looking at all of our data using that DB Browser. But anyway, this is where we would declare if we do decide to use different databases within our project. Basically, we can come here and we would like, oh, I want to use Postgres in my project. Well, all we have to do is say Postgres here, or Postgres SQL. Let's see. Actually, that's not quite right. It's right here. There we go. So as you can see here, there's a couple different ones that they support right out of the box. So currently we're using SQLite 3, but I will in production, and maybe later on in between my when I want to set up two different settings files, we will switch over to Postgres. But for now, we're just actually going to use SQLite 3 in these basic tutorials to get you caught up and up to speed. But here's where we will declare where actually, for example, what's the port number on the database? What is the, let's see, what is the username, right? All of this will be declared here, and how we will pass those variables to the database engine in order to make requests back and forth and to execute SQL queries. So basically, the only time you need to edit this is if you're not using out of the SQLite 3 and you are moving into the production phase. You can use SQLite 3 in production phase, but I don't suggest it, only because it's not robust like Postgres or MySQL. So anyway, this can stay the same as it is for our polls application. However, in the future, we will be changing it. These auth password validator declaration is a list of validations that we use to authenticate users and to save passwords. So, for example, as you can see here, user attribute similarity validator. This compares whether or not the password that they entered is similar to their username. Okay, this one makes sure or ensures that it has a minimum length. So, for example, it's got to have more than 8 characters, right? This one ensures that it's not a commonly used password. And then this one ensures that it is not a strictly numeric password. So that's just the validators that come built in with Django. You can also include your own validators if you'd like. Um, I don't know if we'll touch on that too much, but there is the option to do so, and there's plenty of documentation on how to do that. Next, we have our language code and our time zone. And these use time zone, right? These, I'm not entirely sure what they're used for. I'm pretty sure that has to do with what type of encoding that they use in order to interpret the files. Um, but they more often than not, they will not change unless you're doing something very specific. And then you can disable this or enable this depending on whether or not you want to use a time zone. So the reason why that's important, for example, let's say somebody in California is accessing my website that's hosted in North Carolina. If that's the case, then do I want to display the server time in North Carolina, or do I want to display their local time? Well, more often than not, I probably want to display their local time if I ever do display that in a view. However, it will save that that data. Let's say they sign up for my site, right? It will save that data and the time that they saved it on that North Carolina time. So it's really helpful that it comes built in to use that time zone feature, and it's really nice. This static URL. The static URL is actually very useful. That's something you're probably going to play with second most. The first one is going to be your installed applications, and then this static URL. The static URL has a couple of other different options. For example, let's just pull them up. There's the static root, static file directories, static file finders. Okay, we'll get into those later. Oh, and storage, it looks like. We'll get into those a bit later, but the one thing I want to harp on or talk about is this static URL. Basically, this is the URL that you will be using to access all of your static files. For example, your CSS, your images, your I wouldn't say HTML, but your JavaScript, your Sass, or if you decide to set that up. But anyway, how this works is basically it'll be your the URL that you're going to use. So, for example, if I were using the website www.criticaltechnet, so if I could spell today, right? criticaltechnet.com, and then it would be /static, right? So, for example, if I had a directory in static named image, I would do static image, and then I would do, let's say the image was named 1.jpg. This URL declaration allows us to point all of our URLs within our templates to this static URL. So, for example, if I change the static URL, and I said that it's equal to 123, right? Now, instead of going to this URL to access that image, I would have to go to 123. All right, so hopefully that made sense to you guys, and you will see it whenever we actually start coding the templates. But other than that, that's pretty much covers our entire settings file. If you guys have any questions, comments, criticisms, or concerns, please leave them down in the comments section below. If you liked the video, give me a thumbs up. If you disliked it, tell me why. That's about it. Please hit that like and subscribe button, and I will see you guys later. Thanks for sticking around.